Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Future of CRE Sustainability. I'm your host, Sean Swentek. Today, I'm joined by Luke Lanciano, Director of Sustainability at the Tower Companies. Hey, Luke, thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Glad to be here.
Now, Tower Companies, especially in the CRE space, our companies in solar, battery storage, EV charging, I talk to a lot of people in the CRE space. Not everyone has really leaned aggressively into sustainability in renewable energy like solar, EV charging. Tower Companies is really on the front foot there. I know you have solar across a number of your properties. Can you share just a little bit about your strategy and why you're so forward-facing on sustainability and ESG initiatives?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So the Tower Companies is a private real estate firm based in the DC metro area, established in 1947. So we were, when we were established, sustainability was definitely not a word used quite as often around real estate. But really in the last 25, 30 years, the ownership of the firm has become really interested in how buildings can sort of advance a better environment for all the occupants within those buildings, a better environment for the local communities. And in particular with solar, back in 2013, 2014, we put some solar panels on one of our office buildings down in downtown DC. They were some of the first on a commercial office building in that area of the city. And, it's funny, at the time, they were sort of flat panels just sitting right on top of the roof. I mean, there's some ballasting, but nowadays, it's very standard for a ballasted system to have, the appropriate tilt. You want to really maximize how much solar penetration you can get. And that array was a much smaller one than we are able to do nowadays. So something we just did last year is at that particular building, the Millennium Building over at 1909 K Street, is we took the original 30 kW array and expanded it dramatically. It's at about 120 kW at the moment. And it's going to be able to produce a ton of electricity. We're anticipating somewhere in the neighborhood of 160,000 kilowatt hours annually. And at last count, we're at about 90 since the turn on occurred back in March. So we're doing pretty well thus far in production there. And since 2014, we've really just looked at our portfolio, tried to find those opportunities and utilized, the space that we have on our roof that's, not doing anything really else. And so why not make it a mini power plant for the building?
And from what I'm sure you've seen, the payback period, especially in these last few years of the time of incentives, is just, it's almost a no-brainer if it's in the right space and the right place, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is still a challenge to do. You have to go through not only the permitting process, but the utility interconnection process. Those are no joke. It's amazing how quick the actual construction process is, but then you compare it to the time when you start and are able to get it finally interconnected. That takes up the majority of the project, frankly. So we found that especially in DC, which has a really progressive approach to their renewable energy portfolio standard, that really juices the ability for property owners to leverage solar on their roofs. And especially these last couple of years, the electrical prices have made an even better argument for why you should produce your own power. Yeah, we've seen some pretty substantial price hikes. So luckily, the work that we've done between solar and energy efficiency work, over the past 15 years, we're seeing much less of an impact than many of our, our colleagues in the space, because we've been driving down use. Even if as rates climb, we're keeping sort of that cash basis a bit more steady.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a dangerous guess on utility rates and electricity prices that they're probably going to continue to go up. And so, solar is a nice way to lock in consistent cost basis for a while. What have you seen to be the biggest misconception for property owners around sustainability initiatives when they're thinking about either energy or other sustainability initiatives on a property? Like, as they're looking at the cost benefit analysis, is there common misconceptions that you see?
I think probably the biggest misconception is that sustainability can be separate from operations. Yeah, there's a lot of rightful focus on, the sort of the marketing appeal of having a sustainable building. But I think sometimes that leads people to think that this is more something to market rather than something that actually shifts the operations of the space. So, for example, we work a lot with our building engineers who, they're day in, day out managing large pieces of HVAC equipment. They're, fixing issues in tenant spaces. And because of that, they don't have very much time. They also have a really deep sense of how all these pieces of equipment are operating. And by working directly with them and, finding those opportunities, we can, dramatically reduce the energy use over time and get buy-in from the staff. And from there, the LEED certifications, the, building energy performance standards, all of these sustainability certifications can really follow. Because once you get sort of the operations right, everything else, potentially can fall into place.
Nice. Now, when you're looking at a building and evaluating the building for sustainability improvements, what are some of the metrics you look at to understand the potential?
Two big things I would aim to do is look at their energy benchmarking. Portfolio Manager is a really great tool. There are other tools as well where you can see how over the course of 12 months that building is performing. There's some basic metrics, things like site energy use intensity that can very quickly allow you to benchmark that building across like buildings in the area. From there, the next thing I like to do is just go to the building, see how it feels, like how comfortable is it in that building? What's the average humidity? Like if I'm next to a window and it's sunny, and am I baking in the sun? These are some like fairly straightforward qualitative measures that I think allow you to find those interventions that are most of interest to a property. Because ultimately, like sustainability needs to be a mixture of, cost savings and building improvement that's meaningful to, that property owner so that they can pursue such a measure.
You mentioned energy benchmarking. How has that changed the way you approach building performance optimization?
Well, we've been benchmarking our properties really since about 2005, 2006. I still have some of that data, which is always fun to look back at. And I find it really helpful, especially over time. Like if you have an individual asset, you can really see how it's changed. You can, of course, see very easily the seasonality in energy use. An all electric building is going to have, pretty high energy use often in the winter months. If it's all like electric reheat VABs, you'll of course see all of the cooling load in the summer. And you can see the variability that, either operations or weather plays on that building. And, going a step deeper, what we've done, many of our assets is get real-time energy data. So, instead of just benchmarking by calendar month or by billing period, you can see every day, every 15 minutes, in fact, the energy load in that building. And this is particular to electricity, but we've found that that's a really effective way to see tangibly, like, what is happening in this building on this day or this week, and how is it impacting the total energy load? So for an office building, like the most sort of obvious use profile is people come to work at, sometime between 7 and 9. They leave hopefully sometime around 5 or 6. And, you should see the energy use kind of go up as, the building starts up. It'll stay, at a much higher elevated level, and then it'll come back down during the shutdown process. So my goal is like you take the unoccupancy periods, that basically the nighttime, the weekends, the holidays, and make sure that base load number is as low as it can be, so that things are going off when they should. And then you try to optimize that startup in that shutdown process, so you can shave off sort of some of the peaks that you end up seeing usually around startup. If you have a bunch of air handlers kick on at the exact same time, all of that energy load gets, oftentimes that'll set a peak for you, especially on really hot days, which we've had a few of in DC this past year. And, that really is helpful for both myself and for working with the engineering staff, because they often remember those, really high peak energy use days. They remember because they were sweating, like a dog just outside, trying to make sure the fans are working, trying to, keep folks happy. Of course, that's always the time when something breaks. And, it's really important to connect kind of the work they're doing with the, the energy in the building, because then when, I'm looking at a project where it's a, control system that helps them automate some of these processes, they'll immediately see, oh, wow, that would save me a lot of time. It would help the building be more energy efficient and really just help them do their job so they can focus on sort of those emergent situations rather than the routine areas where you just need to operate the building in a very mechanized fashion.
One of the topics that's kind of a hot topic, I'm seeing a lot of articles about it lately, especially in the office space, is air quality. What are you seeing around that? And what should building managers know, or what do they not know about air quality and its importance to the overall plan?
Yeah, I think air quality is, I always like to start with the most basic air quality metrics that everyone knows, just temperature and humidity. If your building's not comfortable, don't bother like trying to figure out CO2 levels or maybe VOC levels. Focus first on temperature and humidity, and everything else kind of follows. So what those two metrics really start off with is, you can directly feel them for an occupant in the building. If the building is, you might not know exactly why you feel uncomfortable, but you'll feel uncomfortable. If it is too high on a regular basis, it'll affect components of the building. So, drywall, you'll start to see some, markings on it. If you have any sort of panels with glue installed anywhere, it'll start peeling if really the humidity. And the way you manage that is by getting airflow in there.
Yep.
And frankly, that airflow is the stuff that will, help resolve a lot of other of those air quality metrics. So I would always recommend that building managers, don't get too lost in all of the metrics, because there's so many. You can measure, ozone, and I mean we have some air quality sensors that, they cover a lot of different parameters, and I'm glad they do. It's important to make sure there's not too much formaldehyde in your building.
Yeah.
But ultimately, like that temperature and humidity do a huge amount of that work. And they're very easily understood by not only the staff at those buildings, but the occupants in the buildings. You manage those to an appropriate degree using proper air circulation, and a lot of those other things will follow.
How do you approach sustainability differently in multifamily versus office versus other property types that you might have in your portfolio?
I think the biggest thing, sort of mentioned earlier, the occupancy profile of the building, of an office building, is just fairly routine. Occasionally people will need to work on the weekends or do after hours work, and that sort of changes how the building operates. But by and large, office space is fairly predictable. Whereas multifamily, there's some predictability to it. Energy use is always going to peak around the evening times. We see usually between 6 and 9 p.m. is when we hit our peaks during the day in our multifamily assets. And, the other big thing, of course, is we simply have less control in a lot of multifamily spaces. Every individual apartment might have its own thermostat. Of course, there's operable windows in residential units, and that just introduces a range of variables that are very hard to predict. We've had cases where, people will have the windows open for long periods of time in 85% humid weather. And then that, of course, impacts a whole lot of things in that apartment. It can impact like the fan coil system. If that fan coil system is, 45-degree chilled water, it's hitting 80% humid air, it's going to start sweating pretty bad. And that's not something you can predict. It's also, not energy efficient, because you're trying to cool a space that just won't be able to be cooled because it's bringing in all this hot, humid air from outside. And a lot of that, it ends up being tenant education, encouraging people to sort of take, these smaller steps when it comes to managing their energy use in their space. But we find that there's just a lot of challenges with multifamily energy efficiency, because people living in a home, people have a very different relationship to the comfort level that they want and they seek in their home than they do often in their office space. I think it's pretty standard to complain. Maybe it's a little too cold in your office or a little bit too warm. But when you're at home, those complaints turn the volume goes up.
Yeah.
And, our staff, hears about it if there's ever an issue. So we have to find different, options for those buildings. It's really about providing equipment up front where somebody moves in typically, or if a piece of equipment is at the end of its useful life, making sure it gets replaced with a really high efficiency piece of equipment. Because, generally, if that tenant is in there for a long time, we hope they are, we're very lucky to have a fairly low turnover rate in our multifamily assets. Those pieces of equipment that are there when they move in should really be as high efficiency as possible. And that's something we've sort of done over the years, slowly, as folks sort of move out. I was using the example of refrigerators from like the 90s. They were super inefficient. And, if you buy a new, it was the case at one point where you could just buy a new fridge, spend $500-600, and it could pay for itself just in the electrical savings over a couple of years. We don't quite have that level of payback on some of these measures anymore, but over time, you can really see the impact in our buildings. We have some older assets where they compete, their Energy Star scores in the mid to high 80s, but they're 1960s buildings. Typically, that building typology is fairly inefficient, but because we've made these investments over the years, we're able to extract a lot of efficiency while retaining tenants to a really high level. So that's something we're proud of. But I will say that it is the most challenging building typology I've worked on, is the multifamily space.
That's really cool and interesting. And, it's like, how do you balance tenant comfort against, aggressive energy efficiency goals without getting a bunch of complaints? And I'm also interested, since you mentioned it, are you trying to get more data from multifamily through shadow metering or anything like that?
Yeah. Frankly, the way we balance it is comfort trumps energy efficiency. Yeah. Comfort will always just have to trump, sort of a neat sustainability measure that people are not comfortable with.
Yeah.
That's not ultimately going to be a good long-term solution. So, in some sense, one of my past roles was actually managing properties. This is sort of before being in the sustainability space. I was sort of in that role of getting complaints from folks about, my thermostat's not working, or, my air conditioning decided to die. And, even if I might know they turned their air conditioning down to 60 degrees when it was 65 degrees outside for months at a time, you guys still make it work. You can't put any sustainability measures in place that people will dislike. So that's really the thing that we focused on. And you'd be surprised. The complaints get a lot of play, but it's sort of the squeaky wheel always gets the grease. And there aren't as many people complaining as it sounds like. Just they yell a lot louder, right? So what we're able to find is, you have maybe 5% of folks that they're unhappy about a particular thing. You can resolve those 5% of issues usually, even if you go with a less efficient approach for that 5%. You go with a more efficient approach for 95% of folks, you're doing pretty good. You really are able to make folks happy, meet them where they are, and make the building more efficient.
What is the biggest challenge you face when implementing and operating a larger sustainability project like rooftop solar?
I think the main thing that we've found for large scale projects, it's just there are a lot of different stakeholders. So, using an example of solar installation, office building, we, of course, need to make sure that the basic construction rules are followed, that, when vendors are bringing materials to the site, that they're not, bothering other office tenants in the elevator, all these different things. There's conflicts that arise in any construction project. So you can resolve that. That's fairly straightforward for construction. You got to make sure that they're not, tracking dirt through the area, et cetera. But, when it comes to a rooftop project, you also have usually a tenant on the floor below. As good as the roofs are, and, even in older buildings with concrete floor plates, you're going to hear some noise. If somebody is drilling, especially for electrical connections, which solar requires a fair bit of it, you got to manage that relationship with that tenant very effectively, because you don't want to put up a solar project, but then the top floor tenant, who probably pays a good premium for that top floor, decides to move out because they were, they couldn't hold meetings for 2 months while the project was getting underway. So you have to manage that relationship effectively. There's, in a solar project, you're interfacing with not just the AHJ, the authority having jurisdiction for various electrical permits and the like, but it's also the electric utility through that interconnection process. And, oftentimes that can just take a long time, like I was mentioning earlier. So, having all the project staff kind of aware of potential challenges up front is really impactful. It helps reduce the time to interconnection. It helps reduce the time to get building permit finalized and approved. But it just requires a ton of communication up front. Get those stakeholders together and make sure that everyone's aligned so that as the project is underway, you're managing your time as wisely as possible.
How do you measure success beyond just like energy savings, for example, when it comes to measuring the success of sustainability initiatives?
At a very qualitative level, I like to go to, say like the resident events that we'll host at our residential buildings, or, our commercial events that we host at our office buildings. Whenever I introduce myself to somebody and I'm like, I'm that director of sustainability, and they're like, oh, cool, I remember, this project, or I think this building is doing great. And like they recognize the work that we're doing. I find that just incredibly helpful because, not only is sustainability about saving money and saving energy, though those are necessary components of any sustainability effort. I think one of the big things that's harder to measure is how people feel, how the sustainability measures that you're implementing in a building impact the individuals in that building. Because ultimately, one of the big areas that like real estate firms are hoping when they move to a more sustainable paradigm of management is that there will be, there will be some premium, the green premium. And that only exists if people know that sustainable work is happening, if they think it's being done well, or it aligns with kind of what they would like to see happening in their building. And the only way to really know that is ask the people coming in every single day, who might not necessarily be the people signing the lease, but they're coming to work. They're seeing signage about, whether it's a solar project or, some testing work for indoor air quality inspections. There's a lot of things that we do on the sustainability side. We're trying to be forward facing. And a big part of that being successful long-term is for people to recognize it and value it in some fashion.
I love that answer. As someone who works in marketing, I always say, if you want to understand your messaging and its effectiveness, talk to your customers. They're the best source of the answers for you.
Yeah.
How are you seeing tenant expectations around sustainability change the conversation when it comes to leasing?
We've started seeing it in sort of the RFPs that commercial clients are putting out. They want to see like what's your lead rating, what certifications you have in terms of air quality, how does the building manage, X, Y, or Z. And I think that's been really encouraging for us. I always love it because I have a lot of fun answers for them. Be like, oh, well, yeah, we are lead EBOM and we've been recertified multiple times in that particular rating system.
Nice.
There's indoor air quality work. We have Fitwell certifications. We got, UL verified healthy building marks. We have air quality sensor. We do all these fun things. And that has been really helpful because it helps make the case to, certainly folks within our firm that, they might work on like the legal agreements, the commercial leasing aspect, the brokers that we interface with. If they can, if they're seeing those questions from customers, then they know that this stuff matters. This can help make a decision. It's always challenging to figure out exactly how much of an impact it has. I've seen lots of different metrics on the dollar figure, but I think just anecdotally that helps make the case for doing more sustainable work and making sure like people understand that work has value for the occupants in the building.
Makes sense to me. How are new regulations changing the sustainability landscape for CRE owners and operators?
I think the biggest regulatory area that I'm seeing is building performance standards. Typically, these are requirements at either the local level. Given our geography, we're very tightly held. We're not, spread out all over the country. But even in that case, like we have the Washington, D.C. building performance standard. buildings, the Montgomery County Building Performance Standard for our Montgomery County buildings. And there's even a Maryland standard now for buildings, which until recently was also covering our Montgomery County buildings. It seems that there'll be an exemption process that takes effect at some point. But yeah, like I've seen it developed at literally the city, county, and state level at this stage. So it's, I think, probably the biggest area for commercial real estate folks. And it's popping up in jurisdictions all over the country, everywhere from Local Law 87 in New York to California regulations. Lots of individual cities are doing it. Some states are doing it. Boulder, Colorado has one, Seattle, all sorts of different areas. And that in particular is probably the first time where commercial real estate owners have to basically account for how efficient they are with their power, whether that power is electric or gas. It varies based on what metric the performance standard is targeting, but you basically have a certain limit. You can't go beyond a certain level of energy use in those buildings to comply with those standards. And I think that has changed the conversation quite a lot. There's a lot more focus on things like, decarbonization, trying to certainly stretch every watt of power in your building. I've always found like LED retrofits are some of my favorite projects because they're, some of the easiest, quickest payback projects you can find in sustainability. But finally, owners who, might not have been super interested in them are like, oh, wow, we should actually redo our building's lighting system. And, I think the bigger conversations are going to be around large HVAC changes. Because ultimately in, fairly efficient buildings or standard efficiency buildings, if you're far enough away from that standard, you got to make some big changes. And I think there's going to be a lot of continuing innovation in that space. I've seen a lot already, like Local Law 97 in particular, I think has created a little bit of a cottage industry of different methods for keeping a building more efficient, whether that be multifamily housing or office buildings. And lots of people are testing out these different products, and hopefully, like the best products are going to spread to the rest of the country, which I think is really exciting. There's anytime there's a regulatory measure, like it can be a challenge to hit, but I think that has shifted a lot of the nice to have sustainability items to the need to have.
If you could give one piece of advice today to a property owner or portfolio owner and who's looking to start their sustainability journey, but they're feeling overwhelmed by all the options, what would that be?
I think benchmarking is certainly the best way to start. Very easy. It's free through Energy Star's portfolio manager program. You just need your bills. It'll benchmark you against like buildings. So you basically get a score that determines, are you efficient or not based on the type of building you have. And I think that is the best way to start. If you want to go a step deeper, real-time energy metering, that gives you a really good look as to how your building is performing. It's best for electricity, like gas interval metering we found to be a little bit challenging. But, once you have that energy benchmarking piece, you want to dive a little bit deeper, just getting a little bit more data on where the energy is going at what times, help unlock a whole range of possible solutions.
Luke, the commercial real estate market has not, outside of tower companies and some others, not been as aggressive pursuing renewable energy over the last 10 years or so as some folks thought. What do you see for the future? Like, are you bullish? Are you bearish? And do you think that it's going to play a part in sort of the winners and losers and how it shakes out in 10 years from now, whether or not they were, more aggressively pursuing sustainability and energy, especially?
I certainly think what we're doing makes a lot of sense long term. So I'll say we're doing the right thing. But I think in some sense we experienced an interesting moment where energy prices were not necessarily flat, but they were fairly flat. There, inflation was fairly low for a long period of time. You had in the early 2000s the shale boom, which brought natural gas prices really low. That sort of fed into electrical prices at some level. There was deregulation of the energy market. So there were all these opportunities where if the number of units of energy you were using was the same, you could still save money. That world's gone. Like the demand growth that is happening right now is just extraordinary. It is incredibly hard to put large amounts of power generation on the grid. And, it's really hard to build new transmission lines. All of those things should be easier, ideally, but for ratepayers, it has never made more sense to control some of your destiny with renewable energy. So, solar is a great way to do it, especially during the day. As it's sunny, I've been investigating more into batteries. On the commercial scale, it's a little bit more challenging to work without time of use rates in our area. But, that's, I'm sure, going to be an area of, lots of interesting innovation. And the other big area would be, I think, geothermal, ground pumps for like new builds. Cannot beat the efficiency of using the earth as a battery. Having a 100-year approximately HVAC condensing unit, which doesn't require any very much maintenance. It's like one of the simplest systems you can have, but the efficiency is incredible. So I think all of those things are going to be much more popular, even as, various government incentives change.
Love the geothermal shout out. Okay, we're going to just move to 5 quick lightning round questions. 1 word, 1 sentence answer, just your top of your head. What is one emerging proptech solution in building management or anything else that you think will be game changing in the next 5 years?
I think honestly, like a battery that can in 4 hours give you anywhere from like 25 kW to 100 kW. That's a bigger product, but once they get the chemistries right and once they can scale production, I could see those popping up everywhere. Like the payback would be, fairly good if you could scale that.
I love that answer. Great call. Solar, battery storage, small modular nuclear. What is your bet for the fastest growing energy source in commercial real estate in the next 5-10 years?
Solar. There's like batteries are fascinating. I love learning about the chemistries, but I've been learning about the chemistries for a number of years. It's been like a really, scalable commercial scale product. Lithium ion is a really it can be scaled, but there are lots of drawbacks. SMRs, I love the idea of a nuclear renaissance where, we're able to produce, 24/7 carbon-free electricity. In 5 to 10 years, not a single one could get built. I don't think we built a nuclear reactor within a 10-year time frame in decades. Vogtle was quite a long time it took to get built, and I'd love to be more optimistic on that though.
Yeah, same. And I'll have to remember to send you an article I just read on a new battery chemistry that sounds pretty cool and promising for commercial. I'll send it to you after this. What is one of the most important sustainability metrics that you check each day, each week that really is important to you?
I think the biggest one is just your KW load. So when you have real-time energy metering, you're seeing just, like right now I could check any of our buildings. I could see, so we're looking at, about 450 kilowatt hours or kilowatts of direct power going to one of our facilities at 2 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. I'm hoping we can see that drop off. It's before a holiday weekend. There should be less occupancy. And I think that number, at least in my experience, has translated really well to our operating teams. And basically it's make number get lower, like that helps save energy. If you at night have a lower KW, you're doing well. If you have a higher one, you're not doing so well. So I love that metric because of its simplicity and its direct tie to energy use.
I love that you have your dashboard right there in front of you while you're doing this. That's brilliant. Complete this sentence. The biggest myth about green buildings is?
Probably that they're not comfortable. There's this idea that, maybe it's still hangover from the 70s where you're supposed to wear your sweater, that green buildings were just like, they didn't work very well. They weren't very comfortable. You were just saving energy just to make people feel uncomfortable in them. That's the farthest thing I've found from the truth. Really in green, like properly designed green buildings, like you're getting better air quality than anyone else. You're having great outside air intake. You're having usually very tasteful lighting, like LED as a lighting technology gives you great flexibility. And, you're not using a ton of energy with those, but you're getting better lighting, certainly than the old fluorescents that are still far too common in many buildings. And ultimately, the goal of a green building is to reduce the amount of energy you need. So they typically have really good enclosures. So you're not getting drafts and you're not getting some of the negative challenges that poses. So yeah, anybody that says green buildings are not very comfortable buildings has not been in a green building for a while.
All right, last one. You wake up tomorrow, there's a new multifamily property in your portfolio that's an older property. Your boss says, I'm giving you unlimited capital, wouldn't that be nice, to make sustainability upgrades. What's the first thing you're doing?
Oh gosh, unlimited capital. Well, with an older multifamily building, typically what I would imagine is that it's a master metered central plant. Almost certainly, at least in our area, that means gas heat. Unlimited capital. I'm doing geothermal. I'm boring wells wherever I can on that around that property. I'm hoping I have like a decent park area that is also owned right next door. You can put like a bore field. That would be probably the most effective way to drop the overall load of the building. Certainly putting solar on there. And, I think between those two, that means you'll have to have some changes anyways to the HVAC systems in the units, which will effectively make those units more comfortable, more energy efficient. People will like living there more. It'd be a big project, but I think those would be some of the measures that I immediately would think of with unlimited budget.
This is a very appealing property you just described. Hey, Luke, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for joining me, and thank you for being a client of Omnidian's. We're very grateful to have your business. If people, my listeners, want to learn more about the work you're doing or the work of power companies, where's the best place for them to go?
Sure. So our website is towercompanies.com. We're also active on LinkedIn, and we'd be happy to connect with anyone interested.
Amazing. To all my listeners, thank you for tuning in to another episode of The Future of CRE Sustainability. It's been a pleasure, and I'll see you next time.